Anton Mesmer was a German physician and early pioneer in the field of psychology. He is known for developing the process of mesmerism, which is a form of hypnosis that involves inducing a state of altered consciousness in an individual through the use of techniques such as rhythmic breathing, fixation, and verbal suggestion. Mesmer believed that mesmerism could be used to explain certain psychological phenomena and to heal various physical and psychological ailments. The practice of mesmerism eventually gave rise to modern psychology and the development of various mental healing cults, including Christian Science. It is believed that Mesmer's work inspired the development of the school of animal magnetism, which is a form of energy healing that involves the transfer of energy from one person to another through the use of touch or proximity. This practice dates back to ancient Greece, where it was used in the Aesculapia, or healing temples, to treat patients through the process of incubation, which involved placing a patient in a state of magnetic sleep. Some have argued that the founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, was influenced by the teachings of mesmerism and animal magnetism through her interactions with the healer Phineas Quimby, although this is a matter of debate. The Bible contains references to cures that are described as being of a magnetic nature. These cures are often attributed to the great prophets and Jesus, and are said to be accomplished through means other than the laying on of hands. The use of magnetic methods for healing has a long history, dating back to ancient times and continuing through the Middle Ages. Mesmer, a physician from the 9th or 10th century, believed that the imagination of a person could have an effect on their own body as well as on the bodies of others, and that this could be used to heal or harm them. Phineas, a physician from Florence in the same century, believed that diseases could be transmitted or cured through the emission of a vapor or spirit by the eyes or through other means. Pomponius of Mantua believed that some people had special healing abilities and that their touch, glances, or intention of doing good could be used to restore health. Van Helmont, a 16th century scientist who discovered laudanum, ammonia, and volatile salts, also held views similar to those of Mesmer and believed in the existence of a universal agent called magnetism, which he described as an ethereal, pure vital spirit or essence that permeated all bodies and had its seat in the blood of humans. He also believed in the concept of polarity in magnetism, with one principle existing in the flesh and blood of humans and the other belonging to the soul or consciousness. However, he saw soul and body as being integrated rather than discrete entities, and therefore saw magnetism as a single force that manifested in different ways on different planes. The concept of vital magnetism, also known as libido, posits the existence of a universal vital spirit or energy that can be manipulated for the purpose of healing. According to the philosophy underlying this idea, the vital spirit or magnetism is present within every person and can be transmitted through the hands, gaze, or concentrated mental activity to another person in need of healing. The 17th century magnetic healer Valentine Greatrix is known to have cured various diseases, including leprosy, through the use of his hands. The development of the concept of magnetism was advanced by Franz Anton Mesmer and his followers, who proposed a psychological system of healing with great potential for exploration in the future. Mesmer, who was born in Austria in 1734 and received his medical degree from the University of Vienna in 1766, is seen as a key figure in the history of vital magnetism. In his inaugural address, Mesmer proposed that the sun, moon, and stars have a reciprocal effect on each other, causing tides not only in the ocean and sea but in the atmosphere as well. He believed that everything in the universe is connected and affected by a subtle, mobile fluid or energy that permeates all things and brings them into harmony with one another. According to Mesmer, all things in nature have a special power that can act on other bodies without any chemical union or physical contact. This power, which he referred to as animal magnetism, can be transmitted through direct contact with a magnetized body, through the eyes or hands, or even through intention. Mesmer also believed that moral causes and negative attitudes toward life could contribute to diseased states. He believed that disease was a disruption in the natural flow of life and could be caused by physical and emotional factors such as pride, envy, and traumatic experiences. He believed that this vital energy, or animal magnetism, circulates within the body and also emanates from it to some degree. When a rapport is established between a patient and healer, this energy can flow between the two people, similar to how blood flows through veins and arteries. In the early phase of his career, two Jesuit priests named Gassner and Hegel had a significant influence on Franz Mesmer, a German physician who is credited with the development of the theory of animal magnetism, which later became known as mesmerism. Gassner imparted to Mesmer the secret of strengthening the curative effect of treatment by moving the hands over the diseased parts of the body, a technique later known as passes. He also believed that there were two main types of disease, those that could be cured through ordinary medical treatments and those that could only be cured through prayer and exorcism. Mesmer added a third category, which he called mixed, requiring both prayer and medication, which we would today consider a psychosomatic illness. From Hegel, Mesmer obtained magnetized steel plates, which were claimed to have a curative effect when placed on different parts of the body. However, Mesmer eventually stopped using these plates and instead employed the banquet, a large tub containing glass bottles, iron filings, and metal rods. In group sessions held in a large salon, people would sit around the banquet, grasping the metal rods, while Mesmer, dressed in a silken gown and wielding a wand, moved silently from person to person, touching them lightly with the wand and speaking softly to them. Some patients in these sessions experienced convulsions or other psychological states such as catalepsy, hysteria, or apathy. It is unclear whether these responses were due to suggestion and contagion or the alleged magnetic virtue of the banquet, but some patients who had been previously deemed incurable by medical doctors reportedly regained their physical and spiritual well-being as a result of these sessions. Mesmer's theories were controversial and met with a lot of criticism, especially from the medical community, which saw his use of magnets and other paraphernalia as unscientific. Despite this criticism, Mesmer's treatments were reportedly successful in curing a wide variety of diseases and conditions. Mesmer believed that the human body was a closed circuit of magnetic fluid that participated in larger cosmic circuits of magnetism and vitality. He believed that by increasing the flow of magnetism through the body and achieving an equilibrium of the disturbed vitality, he could hasten the magnetic crisis and bring about a state of health. To do this, he used techniques such as passes, moving his hands over the patient's body, his own benevolent intention, and fixed gaze to aid concentration, which he saw as the equivalent of prayer. Mesmer's fame spread throughout Europe, and he was subjected to several royal commissions to scientifically investigate his cures. However, these investigations were generally unfavorable, and Mesmer's reputation suffered as a result. The medical community of the time was resistant to non-traditional healing methods and saw Mesmer's work as unscientific and fraudulent. After Mesmer, the Abbé Ferrier, a French priest, took up the study of mesmerism and developed a psychological view of the subject that is similar to modern views. Ferrier did not believe that there was any actual communication or equilibration of magnetism between the healer and patient, but rather saw the therapy as being purely psychological in nature. This view was not widely accepted at the time and was eventually forgotten. Despite this, Mesmer's system of inducing a crisis in the patient through the use of magnetism was still followed by many practitioners, particularly in Germany. However, there were also other schools of thought on animal magnetism, including the school of de Barberin, which believed that the cures were the result of faith alone and were achieved through religious exhortation and prayer. This school had some successes, particularly among those who were inclined towards religious belief, but it left little record of its existence. The experimental school of magnetism, which included practitioners such as the Marquis de Puysegur, Baron du Potet, Deleuze, and La Fontaine, eventually displaced both the school of Mesmer and the school of de Barberin. These practitioners were known as the great magnetizers and were influential in the development of magnetism as a therapeutic technique. De Puysegur, in particular, moved away from Mesmer's theories and practices and is credited with developing many of the concepts that are now associated with hypnotism. The Marquis de Puysegur was a French doctor who is considered the real discoverer of animal magnetism, also known as mesmerism, as a phenomenon rather than a theory. He is the founder of the experimental school of mesmerism, which differed from the theories of Franz Mesmer, the original proponent of mesmerism. Mesmer believed that magnetism was an omnipresent force that permeated all things and that the magnetic cure involved adjusting the flow of magnetic currents within the patient's body. In contrast, de Puysegur believed that the operator transmitted their own superabundant magnetism or vitality to the patient and that this transmission was responsible for the restoration of health. De Puysegur made two important discoveries related to mesmerism. The first was that in the drowsy or somnambulistic state induced by mesmerism, it was possible to communicate with the patient and obtain evidence of a high level of intelligence. This state, known as somnambulism, was previously known to Mesmer, but he rarely interfered with it, considering it a natural state. De Puysegur was interested in this discovery because it showed evidence of telepathy, or the ability to communicate mentally without the use of physical communication. This discovery led to the development of higher phenomena in mesmerism, which included telepathy, clairvoyance, mind reading, and community of sense and perception. The development of higher phenomena in mesmerism, including telepathy, clairvoyance, mind reading, and community of sense and perception, was a result of de Puységur's first discovery in the field of mesmerism. De Puységur's second discovery, made in 1811, was the finding of how to more quickly and efficiently produce the somnambulistic state, which was achieved through the use of long passes. Several years later, du Potet focused on the effect of the will and on benevolent intentions and placed more emphasis on the fixation of the eye and the use of passes than de Puységur did. Du Potet believed that there was a living force, a divine dynamic power wielded by the soul or mind, which could act upon dead forces like electricity and magnetism. He believed that this force, when set into motion by thought and will, could produce effects that were currently unknown and needed to be studied experimentally. Du Potet adopted Mesmer's idea that when this spiritual force is set into motion, it has the ability to spread and achieve its goals divinely and effortlessly. La Fontaine, who has been referred to as the last of the great magnetizers, relied almost exclusively on the use of passes and the exertion of his will, although he sometimes established contact magnetically through the hands while looking into the eyes of his subjects. Unlike du Potet, who was an experimentalist, La Fontaine focused on the treatment of disease and appealed to the general public for support. He received pupils and tried to establish societies that would continue their studies and healing work after he was gone. La Fontaine produced clairvoyant phenomena at his demonstrations as evidence of the reality and importance of magnetism. He believed that people had the ability to cure each other's diseases without the use of drugs or doctors, and had a large number of successful cures, particularly among those in the higher social classes who had tried other forms of therapy without success. LaFontaine's successes in curing diseases were seen as proof of the reality of animal magnetism, similar to how Christian scientists believe that the results they achieve demonstrate the validity of their beliefs. However, the experimentalists in mesmerism also provided new forms of proof, such as the production of anesthesia, analgesia, clairvoyance, and trance. These phenomena, while not the primary focus of mesmerism, was seen as evidence of its validity and helped to gain popular support for the practice. However, LaFontaine's emphasis on producing psychic phenomena, particularly clairvoyance, for popular support rather than on healing the sick led to a moral disintegration of the field of mesmerism. De Puysegur, who had anticipated this danger, tried to avoid speaking about these psychic phenomena in order to maintain a scientific examination of the subject. However, the facts eventually became widely known and the focus shifted from healing to the production of these phenomena. Somnambules were individuals who were put into a trance-like state, known as mesmerism, by the use of magnetic passes, and were believed to have the ability to see clairvoyantly into the bodies of the patients they examined. It was believed that they could accurately diagnose the nature, location, and severity of any disease present and prescribe the most effective remedies to help. This practice was seen as a departure from drugless therapy, and the use of allopathic, conventional therapeutics snuck in through the back door. It was later observed that the somnambules mainly prescribed remedies that they were familiar with, which often included bleeding, blistering, and purging, which were common medical practices at the time. Phineas Quimby, an American healer and philosopher, came to believe that disease was a deranged state of mind and could be cured through a change in the patient's mental attitude. Quimby believed that the key to curing disease was to alter the patient's perspective or viewpoint on their illness. He believed that this change in attitude could lead to physical and neurological changes in the body and ultimately result in a cure. Quimby's methods involved sitting with his patients, listening to their complaints, and then using conversation and suggestions to alter their habitual mental attitudes towards their illness. Quimby believed that this change in perspective could be accomplished through the power of the mind and did not necessarily require the use of medication or other traditional forms of treatment. He cited examples of people experiencing sudden improvements in health due to a mental shock or change in perspective, such as a paralyzed person being able to walk again after experiencing a traumatic event. Quimby became convinced of the mind's ability to cure disease while he was practicing mesmerism, but later abandoned this practice and focused on using conversation and suggestion to alter his patients' mental attitudes. He believed that by disabusing patients of their false beliefs about their illness and helping them to realize the truth that false beliefs were responsible for their disease, he could induce a cure. In the year 1859, Phineas Quimby moved to Portland, Maine, where he remained until the summer of 1865. During this time, Quimby treated the sick using his particular method of explanation and suggestion. This method involved sitting with his patients, listening to their complaints, and using conversation and suggestions to alter their habitual mental attitudes towards their illness in an effort to induce a cure. Many patients who received treatment from Quimby during this period experienced significant improvements in their health and went on to spread the gospel of mental healing throughout the country and the world. One of these patients was Mary Baker Eddy, who credited Quimby with healing her of a long period of sickness and inefficiency. Eddy was extremely enthusiastic about Quimby and his method of treatment, and wrote about him in a local newspaper in effusive terms, comparing him to Christ and other great healers. While some have suggested that Eddy was indebted to Quimby intellectually and technically, and that much of Christian Science can be attributed directly to his influence, others have argued that the relationship between the two was more complex and that Eddy's debt to Quimby went beyond simply absorbing his views on healing. Mary Baker Eddy was heavily influenced by Phineas Quimby and his methods of mental healing. Quimby demonstrated to Eddy the power of the mind to affect and control physiological function, and this provided her with a new orientation and understanding of the mind-body connection. However, while Quimby had shown the effectiveness of using the mind to overcome physical incoordinations, Eddy still needed a philosophical rationale to understand the underlying mechanisms of this process. This additional understanding and rationale came from other sources and allowed Eddy to develop her own unique philosophy and practice, which became known as Christian Science. While Phineas Quimby and other practitioners of mesmerism may have had a minor influence on Mary Baker Eddy, her practice of Christian Science was not directly derived from mesmerism. Christian Science does not utilize the technical procedures or focus on the production of psychical phenomena associated with mesmerism, but rather suggests a method by which every aspect of an individual's life can be affected and improved. Quimby recognized that disease states could be related to states of mind, or false beliefs and errors, but did not extend this idea to the wide range of problems that make up the difficulties of human existence. In contrast, Eddy believed that the principles of Christian Science could be applied to all manner of issues, including sickness, poverty, and other problems, and saw it as a unifying force in the realm of mind healing. It can be fairly well established that mesmerism, as the historical antecedent of a mind healing system, had only a minor effect on Mary Baker Eddy. There was very little direct influence from this source on her. None of the major ideas or even the technical procedures peculiar to the magnetists can be found in her system in any way. However, what mesmerism did accomplish for her through her interactions with Quimby was to suggest an entirely new method for positively affecting the body and its specific disease states. However, if we only focus on this aspect, we have not done Mrs. Eddy justice. Now that the initial excitement and attention surrounding the publication of her book has died down, we can afford to be more generous and give credit where credit is due. Quimby and most of the magnetists focused on producing impressive psychical phenomena of the trance states or on spectacular healings of cases that could not be treated in other ways. But this is not the case with Mrs. Eddy and her work, Christian Science. Science and health, despite their shortcomings in any direction, is not only a system for healing sick bodies or minds but also a method for positively affecting every aspect of an individual's life. Currently, we are not concerned with a critical evaluation of the claims made by Christian scientists about miraculous cures, the elimination of undesirable moral traits, and the attainment of material wealth. We will evaluate these claims later on and criticize them if necessary. What is important for us to recognize now is that the applicability of Christian Science as an auto-hypnotic method far exceeds anything that Quimby or Mesmer and his disciples could have imagined. In order to examine the potential relationship between the philosophers of Vedanta and the ideas of Mary Baker Eddy, as well as the possibility of plagiarism, we must take a closer look at the salient features of Vedanta. Vedanta philosophy, the earliest and most prominent of the three systems mentioned, bears a striking resemblance to Eddy's own metaphysics on the surface. According to Vedanta, the only true reality is Brahman, or God, the absolute and spiritual being behind all of existence. The material world is considered to be Maya, or illusion, and only a relative and temporary interpretation of sensory information. This concept of the world being illusory is similar to what modern science has also come to conclude. The idea of Brahman is described as the infinite being and substance, infinite wisdom and truth, and infinite love and bliss, and the teaching of Sankaracharya, a prominent commentator on Vedanta, encapsulates this idea in the lines Brahman is true, the world is false, the soul is Brahman and is nothing else. To understand the extent of the relationship between Vedanta and the ideas of Mary Baker Eddy, it would be necessary to examine the philosophers more closely. How do we know this outside world, the validity and reality of which we question, to assume that it is false? Only through our senses. We know the outside world, such as a typewriter on a table, through our sight, touch and hearing. We see it, feel it and hear its clicking when in operation. However, according to Vedanta's philosophy, our sensory experiences are not direct or immediate experiences of the true reality of the external world. Our experiences are limited to a series of sensory reactions, which are then translated and interpreted in the brain as a mental picture. This mental picture is not necessarily a true representation of reality. According to Vedanta, we live exclusively in a world of mind and ideas, and what we perceive as the external world is also a part of this world of the mind. Both external and internal experiences are ultimately a part of God and His infinite mind. There is no separation between the ego and non-ego, between the spirit and nature. We live in God and His omnipresence. Vedanta, therefore, argues that what is perceived objectively is also a part of God. It is God within that provides the subjective interpretation within the brain. The Vedanta philosophy posits that our ordinary understanding of the world is based on ignorance. We do not truly understand our own nature or how we perceive God in the world. We suffer from a lack of understanding, or ignorance, which leads to many other errors and mistakes. This understanding is similar to the scientific view that the senses can be deceiving and therefore, instruments are needed to correct the inaccuracies of our perception. For example, it appears that the sun rises every morning, but this is not true. It's the Earth's rotation that creates this illusion. The Vedanta emphasizes the idea that what we perceive as reality is in fact just an illusion, and that only through self-realization and understanding can one transcend this illusion. This idea is also apparent in medicine, where a patient may appear to be healthy but in fact have an underlying disease that went unnoticed due to a lack of symptoms. In order to truly understand the nature of things, various tools and instruments are needed to overcome the limitations of our senses and knowledge. Vedanta's philosophy posits that our ordinary knowledge is simply the result of ignorance. According to Vedanta, our true nature is within, and we are unaware of how we become aware of God in the objective world. They argue that we suffer from a chronic psychic scotoma, which they call ignorance, the first and major sin. They argue that our ordinary knowledge is deceitful and untrue. This belief is similar to the scientific attitude which also distrusts the evidence of the unaided senses, and thus has developed instruments of varying degrees of sensitivity to correct this sensory inaccuracy. The objects we perceive in the world are not made of physical matter, but rather are ideas that exist in the mind of God. He posits that we can't conceive of any substance existing outside of the mind perceiving it. Berkeley also distinguishes between ideas that arise in the mind through memory or imagination and those that are received through sensory experience. He argues that the latter is more powerful and lasting and that they must have a cause beyond our own will, which can only be God, who is the ground of these objective ideas and the objective world itself. Berkeley's idea is that these real things are ideas created and perceived by the mind of God, which is external to our own minds and not generated or created within the mind itself, which we are able to partake and perceive as humans who essentially has the same substance and spirit of God. Berkeley's philosophy suggests that the objective, orderly and necessary nature of our ideas derived from sensation and perception are the result of laws established by God. Despite this, the constant and uniform workings of these laws do not necessarily lead to thoughts of God, but instead lead to thoughts of secondary causes. The main goal of Berkeley's philosophy is to bring people's thinking back to God and to further the causes of the Roman Catholic Church. It is unlikely that the founder of Christian Science, Mrs. Eddy, would have been familiar with Berkeley's ideas or had access to academic philosophy. However, some of Berkeley's ideas and arguments about the non-validity of a world of matter could potentially improve the Christian Science system intellectually. It is suggested that Mary Baker Eddy may have been influenced by the philosophy of George Berkeley in her development of Christian Science, though there is no concrete evidence to prove this. Eddy read a number of books in her childhood, including Lindley Murray's Introduction to the English Reader and The English Reader, which contained samples of writing from many 18th century thinkers, including some of Berkeley's contemporaries. However, Berkeley himself is not represented in those books. Similarities in the language and ideas found in Berkeley's works and those in Eddy's Science and Health, but does not provide any concrete evidence of direct influence. They do note that while Berkeley's ideas and teachings were philosophical in nature, Eddy applied them in a practical way to overcome poverty, sin, and sickness, and that Berkeley never pursued this line of logic. There's a significant difference between the spiritual perspective of Mary Baker Eddy and that of George Berkeley, an Irish bishop. Eddy believed that people have a spiritual connection to the divine mind and God's order, and through this connection, people partake in God's eternal and flawless perfection. On the other hand, Berkeley believed in the existence of objective factors in the world of reality and that they function within the ground of the divine mind. Berkeley never had any similar train of thought to that of Mrs. Eddy, and instead had a preoccupation with the merits of tar water, which he believed to be a universal panacea for all human ills at the end of his life. A proper understanding of the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who is known for being very abstruse and complicated, would require a separate study. He also mentions that the aim of this passage is to determine whether or not there was any obligation of this German philosopher on the part of Mary Baker Eddy. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher born in 1770, who is known for having a philosophical perspective that saw the objective world of experience as a progressive embodiment of the mind. He placed a great emphasis on reason as a central concept in understanding the world. But the author suggests that Mary Baker Eddy would not have agreed with this idea, as she believed that reason was part of the complex mortal mind and not a useful or accurate way of understanding reality. Some critics have pointed out similarities between Eddy's ideas and those of Hegel, but argue that these similarities are likely not significant, as Eddy would have denied the idea of the embodiment of mind and rejected the notion that reason alone could provide insight into the truth. Hegel believed that things should be judged by their surroundings, environment, and the role they play in it, and advocated for understanding how reason or spirit unfolds in the world of experience. The idea of the reason being objective in the world and not just subjective in oneself is something that Eddy would have strongly denied in her own philosophy. Hegel believed that the best way to understand reality is by looking at it in its concrete form and not by making abstract statements about it. He also believed that the world of experience is a system of reason with its own laws, and his philosophy is an attempt to uncover and explain these laws. He asserts that thought and reality are identical, but this statement has been sometimes misunderstood to imply that our individual thoughts are the sole reality, or that reality is a set of mental abstractions opposed to sensory data. He, however, believed that concrete experience in the objective world is the starting point and the end, and that it is rational throughout. The author notes that this is in contrast with Mary Baker Eddy's ideas, which rejected matter and emphasized that reality consists of God and the infinite array of ideas in his divine mind. Hegel believed that every element of the experience is connected to a rational whole and has a definite place and function in it, and it can be understood by thinking. He understood reality as coextensive with significance and experience, and denied the existence of an invisible substrate of matter beyond the phenomenal world or any opaque thing in itself that we can never perceive. He believed that there is no transcendent truth that can be reached by an abstract reasoning process distinct from the reason which is in things themselves. He believed that what does not enter into experience is nothing, and that the system of experience itself in all its implications is reality and is God. He thus believed that God and the laws of spirit are the real essences of the universe, in terms of which everything is to be understood, and that we do not have to go outside of our experience to find the truth of reality. One of the main goals of philosophy, as understood by Hegel, is to understand the meaning of each experience factor that has ever revealed itself to man through its relation to the whole rational world where it belongs. This is done by using a logical process of development which Hegel calls the dialectic. This process involves combining the oppositions and contradictions of the world in a richer whole, rather than denying or annulling them. This process is fundamentally opposed to Mary Baker Eddy's philosophy, which posits that God and his ideas alone are real and enduring, and all else is illusion and error. If Eddy had read and understood Hegel's ideas, she would have rejected them. The dialectic provides Hegel with a schema of 3 logical stages, in which the thesis is followed by or negated by antithesis, and this again is negated by the synthesis, which negates the negation and includes both thesis and antithesis, transcending them in development. For instance, a typical thesis would be God, which is logically posed by the idea of the world of matter, evil, and darkness. But this duality is negated as well as reconciled in the synthesis of the dialectic, which is the man. Therefore, according to Hegel, only the whole is real, and not any partial stage of development or even the end of development as a finished product. He argues that reality is the process of development itself, considered in its entirety, that is the real, that is spirit and God. There is no substantial contact between Mary Baker Eddy's philosophy and that of Hegel, specifically in relation to the dialectic. Hegel's concept of religion focuses on the dialectical relationship between thought and object, finite and infinite. He is not concerned with proving the existence of God or the truth of religion, but rather interpreting the religious experience, which he sees as identical to God. Philosophy can understand the religious experience, but cannot create or induce it. As God is seen as existing within experience, the more comprehensive the experience, the more adequately God is revealed. Religion is seen as a process of development and growth, requiring rational interpretation rather than judgment. In Hegel's dialectic process, the elements of the religious idea are God, man, and the relationship between them, and these elements underlie the successive stages of religious development. For example, in the Oriental religions, the idea of the infinite prevails, with God seen as everything and the world as an illusion. In contrast, the religion of the Greeks is a religion of naturalism and the finite, with man as the final object of worship and God's being human attributes embodied in art and poetry. Hegel reconciles and negates the Greek and Oriental religious types in Christianity, which he views as the absolute religion. The important aspect of Christianity is the concrete unity of the divine and human in Christ, the God-man. Christ represents the dialectical synthesis of all previous divine personalities and the culmination of them at the same time. Christianity finds God, the infinite, in the finite, in human consciousness, and in the process of the world of experience. Hegel's philosophy encompasses all aspects of human thinking and experience, from epistemology to aesthetics, religion, institutions, ontology, psychology, and ethics, all in the light of his integrative logic. It is such a vast and extensive system that it eludes all but the best minds and baffles description in anything else but volumes. It should be noted that Hegel's approach is a logical one while Mrs. Eddy's is not, and many of the problems of science and health remain unsolved. This is not to say that Mrs. Eddy's work is not valid, but that it is not based on logic and that major philosophical problems have not been logically elucidated by her. The problem of how false beliefs could be entertained is not answered in her work, while Hegel's approach attempts to indicate some emergent or evolutionary process based on dialectic. The focus is on the practical elements and not on the theoretical principles of philosophical discussion. When comparing Hegel and Mrs. Eddy, there is little relationship between the two systems. It is unlikely that Mrs. Eddy borrowed much from German transcendentalism beyond the use of the word apodictic. The interpretation of Hegel's philosophy of religion presented by Francis Lieber in the book by Reverend Walter M. Hochschild may or may not be authentic Hegelianism. There is little similarity between Hegel and Mrs. Eddy. Reverend Hochschild should have pointed out that the dialectical process of thesis, its negation, and the negation of the negation, which is the foundation of Hegelianism, is not mentioned by Lieber. If Francis Lieber did write this essay on Hegel's religious philosophy, and if Mrs. Eddy had access to it in the home of Hiram Crafts, there are similarities between the two that cannot be ignored. The question of whether there was plagiarism is not for the author to determine, and it is up to experts to decide. Despite this, similarities do exist, leading to certain inescapable conclusions. From a practical perspective, the philosophers of Vedanta, Berkeley, and Hegel are all speculative academic philosophers, with the exception of Vedanta, which has developed some of the noblest and lofty concepts in philosophy and spiritual development techniques. However, none of these philosophers made a significant attempt to radically change the lives of people through the practical application of their theories. There is no one alive today who has healed themselves of disease, overcome poverty, or succeeded in business or social life through a systematic application of these philosophers' theoretical principles. Mrs. Eddy's approach to philosophy, however, is different. Her own hardships, disappointments, and frustrations from sickness and poverty led her to develop a philosophy that has allowed thousands of people to improve their lives. She may not have added to the scientific understanding of the method she employed, but her employment of ideas and images has produced tangible results. Science demands more insight into the workings of the methods used, not only an insistence on results. We have no more understanding now than before of how metaphysics can alter the environment we live in. Even though results have occurred as proven by objective and critical investigators, we don't understand how. Mrs. Eddy's approach doesn't fit within the same category as philosophers like Sankaracharya, Berkeley, Kant, or Hegel. Mrs. Eddy was a pioneer in the world of spirit in a way that Berkeley and Hegel were not. She must be considered a spiritual revolutionary who was dissatisfied with the separation between the world of spirit and the world of matter. She believed that there must be some relationship between them, or else anarchy exists. Even though she denied the existence of matter existing apart from the mind, she acted pragmatically as if matter did exist and devoted her entire life to proving that the sphere of her denial could be impacted by the mind and its ideas, and so altered and changed in accordance with the heart's desire. Mrs. Eddy established a connection between states of mind and bodily conditions and believed that if diseases can be caused by faulty mental states, they can also be altered by new ideas, revolutionizing the process of human thinking. It was Quimby who first showed her that mind could affect and improve bodily health. Her philosophy gave her a broad view of life and living which enabled her to apply Quimby's orientation to mind healing in such a way as to negate and transcend his findings. Mrs. Eddy attempted to deal with every adverse condition of human existence in any field of endeavor, whereas Quimby dealt only with disease states of the body and mind. She was revolutionary in the true sense of the word. The world was never quite the same place after her advent. She changed the world's outlook in a host of ways. Even if her schema has not been scientifically acceptable or universally adopted to bring about the millennium she envisaged, enough of a millennium was accomplished in the private lives of her devotees to prove her point. The results produced by her disciples are unique and challenging to compare with any other previous system. Neither mesmerism nor hypnotism, neither orthodox religion nor any of its reform cults, can produce anything that will stand up for comparison with a Wednesday night testimonial meeting in a Christian Scientist church. As a revolutionary, Mrs. Eddy was not obligated to think things out concretely to their logical conclusion. Her system may be lacking in providing a complete logical system of metaphysics in the formal academic sense, but the full working out and summation of a revolution demands the patient work of faithful and inspired successors. The task of the genius is to point out the way to a new and higher level of thought and action than what has previously been achieved. Without great artists, thinkers, and reformers, the world would stand still. A world stationary in terms of its spiritual and mental life would be stagnant and deteriorating, so the genius acts as a luminary and a catalytic agent. Just as a catalyst facilitates the desired chemical reaction, genius brings about a revolution in human concepts. Whatever may be said antagonistically about the person and work of Mrs. Eddy, it must be acknowledged that she was first and foremost a spiritual catalytic agent and a revolutionary. She engineered, through her personal chemistry, a revolution in human thinking that cannot be fully estimated even now. Her mark is left on the world and in the lives of people, going beyond mere indebtedness to Quimby. She challenged the accepted modes of thought and rules of action in society, which was met with resistance, revile, and persecution. Despite this, her work endures. Her name lives in the hearts of those who have reason to be grateful to her, and the general tenets of her practical system have been confirmed by modern psychotherapy. The work of a revolutionary becomes the accepted creed of the following generation, and that is what Mrs. Eddy has accomplished. That is why I regard her, despite all else, as one of the world's great geniuses. She was a pioneer in the world of spirit, in a way that Berkeley and Hegel were not, and should be considered a spiritual revolutionary who was dissatisfied with the dichotomy between the world of spirit and the world of matter. While her system may not have provided a complete logical system of metaphysics, it has provided practical solutions for many people. Her ideas have influenced many people to change their lives for the better and improve their physical and mental health. Even though her ideas may not be universally accepted, her legacy endures and her name will continue to be remembered in history as a spiritual leader, revolutionary thinker, and catalyst for positive change.